I want to take you inside a room I was just in because what happened in that room is something I don't think enough businesses in Charlotte County are seeing, or maybe more importantly, understanding. I recently attended a reverse trade show, and during that event, Mark on the Move led a session on government contracting. And going into it, I'll be honest with you, I expected what you usually get with this topic, something very structured and very process heavy, probably a lot of terminology, something that makes you feel like you need to take notes just to keep up. But that's not what this was. This was one of those sessions where within the first few minutes, you realize this is going to be different. And it was conversational, it was interactive, it felt less like a presentation and more like someone just pulling back the curtain and saying, let me show you how this actually works. And one of the first things he said, and I wrote this down mentally because it stuck, was essentially this idea of make connections, build relationships. This is one stop shopping. And I want to slow that down because I think there's more in that statement than people realize. Make connections, and that's simple, but it's not easy for everyone because that requires showing up. That requires putting yourself in a room. That requires starting conversations when you might not feel fully prepared to have them. Build relationships. That's not a one time thing. That's not walking up, shaking a hand, and moving on. That's follow up, that's familiarity, that's being remembered. And then one stop shopping. That's access. That's the ability to walk into a room and talk to multiple agencies, multiple decision makers, multiple opportunities, all in one place. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is the part businesses underestimate because I think a lot of businesses still believe that government contracting is something that happens behind a screen, that it's all online portals, registrations, forms, submissions. And yes, those things exist. But what I saw in that room was something completely different. I saw access, I saw conversations happening in real time. I saw people asking questions and getting immediate answers, and I saw relationships starting. And that's when it really clicked for me. The barrier for most businesses isn't necessarily capability. It's not always pricing. It's not even always competition. A lot of times it's proximity and it's being close enough to the conversation to even know where to start. And that's what a reverse trade show does. It brings the conversation to you. Now, if you've never been to one of these, let me paint the picture a little more clearly because it's important. In a traditional trade show, businesses are the ones setting up booths. You're the one trying to attract attention. You're pitching, you're selling, you're hoping the right person walks by. In a reverse trade show, that entire dynamic flips. And the agencies are the ones set up. They're the ones saying, here's what we need. They're the ones answering questions. They're the ones having conversations with you. And that shift removes a lot of the friction that businesses usually feel because now you're not guessing. You're not trying to figure it out on your own. You're not sending emails into a void. You're having a conversation. And that's a completely different experience. And I think that is worth pausing on because for a lot of small businesses, that alone changes the emotional barrier. It is one thing to sit at your desk and try to decode a government website. It is another thing entirely to stand in front of a real person and say, help me understand where I fit.
That is a much more human entry point.
It makes the process feel less intimidating. It makes the room feel more open. And frankly, it makes people more willing to take that first step. There was a moment during the session where Mark said something along the lines of, jump in the deep end, have fun, you'll figure it out along the way. And I want to stay on that for a second because I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. This idea that you need to be ready before you start, that you need to understand everything before you step into the space, that you need to feel confident before you show up. But what he was saying, and what I think businesses need to hear more often, is the opposite. You don't get ready first, you get in first, and then you figure it out. And I could see that landing with people in the room because you could feel the shift. People started to relax a little bit. They started to engage more. They started to ask questions. And those questions weren't polished. They weren't perfect, but they were real. And that's where learning actually happens, not when everything is structured and scripted, but when people feel comfortable enough to say, I don't know how this works. Can you explain it? And honestly, I think that is one of the most valuable things about a session like this. It gives people permission to not know. It gives people permission to start from zero. And that matters because government contracting can feel like one of those spaces where everyone else already knows the rules and you are the only one trying to catch up. What Mark did well was take some of that pressure off. He made it feel like this was learnable, not easy necessarily, and not instant, but learnable. And sometimes that's the mindset shift people need. Another thing that really stood out to me was how interactive the session was. He wasn't just talking, he was pulling people into the conversation, calling on them, asking them to respond, creating moments where the room had to participate. And that might sound like a small detail, but it's not, because participation creates ownership, and ownership leads to action. There was even a moment where he had someone shout something out, almost like a quick interaction or call and response, and you could feel the energy shift in the room. It went from passive listening to active engagement. And once that happens, people are no longer just attending, they're involved. And when people are involved, they retain more, they connect more dots. They start mentally applying the information to their own business. They stop thinking, this is a presentation I'm sitting through, and start thinking, okay, how would this work for me? That is a big difference. Because once someone starts putting themselves into the scenario, they stop being an observer and start becoming a participant in their own next step. He also took time to bring other people into the conversation. He introduced Julie Rodriguez from the Port Authority, referenced longstanding relationships with others in the industry, including connections at RSW. And again, that wasn't random, that was intentional, because it reinforces something that I think is easy to overlook. This entire space is connected. People know each other. They work together. They share information. They refer businesses that they remember who they've met. So when you enter that space, you're not just connecting with one person, you're stepping into a network. And that's where things start to compound, because one conversation leads to another, one introduction leads to another. One relationship opens the door to others. And that is such an important concept for businesses that are new to this, because I think a lot of people assume every opportunity starts from scratch, that every contract is a cold process, that you just wait for something to get posted, submit your information, and hope for the best. But what this session reminded me of is that relationships still matter. Reputation still matters. Being remembered still matters. And none of that means the process is unfair or informal. It means there is still a human element to how opportunities are recognized, shared, and pursued. Now, let me bring this back to something I was thinking about while sitting in that room, because I wasn't just listening, I was observing, and I kept asking myself, who's not here? Who should be in this room that isn't? Which businesses in Charlotte County would benefit from this but aren't showing up? Which companies have the capability but not the connection? Because that's the gap. And it's a bigger gap than people realize. We have businesses here that are more than capable. They have the talent, they have the services, they have the experience, but they're not visible in these spaces. And if you're not visible, you're not part of the conversation. And if you're not part of the conversation, you're not part of the opportunity. And that's not because the opportunity isn't there. It's because there's a disconnect between the business and the environment where those opportunities exist. And this is where I think local business owners sometimes underestimate themselves. They assume government work is for somebody bigger, somebody more established, somebody who already has all the certifications, all the experience, all the right language. Meanwhile, they may already have exactly the service, the reliability, and the local knowledge that an agency actually needs. But if they never show up, nobody knows they exist. If they never start the conversation, nobody can connect them to anything. So part of what I walked away thinking was not just, this was a good session. It was, we need more businesses hearing this. Another thing that kept coming up in the session without being explicitly stated was this idea of overcomplication. And I see this all the time. The moment something feels complex, people step back and they assume it's not for them. They assume they need more time, more knowledge, more preparation. But what I saw in that room was the opposite approach. Simplify it, strip it down, focus on what actually matters, show up, have conversations, ask questions, follow up. That's it. Everything else, you can learn. Everything else, you can figure out. Everything else comes with time and experience. But if you never take that first step, none of it happens. And I think that is a powerful reminder for any business in any stage of growth. And sometimes the biggest thing holding people back is not the process itself. It is the story they are telling themselves about the process, that it is too hard, too technical, too formal, too late, too competitive, too unfamiliar. And what Mark really seemed to do in that room was strip away some of that noise and say, in plain language, start where you are. And that is a very practical message. Not glamorous and not flashy, but useful. And that brings me to something else that I think is really important, momentum. Because attending something like this is not the outcome, it's the starting point. And this is where I think a lot of businesses lose the opportunity. They attend, they listen, they walk away feeling motivated, and then they go back to their normal routine. No follow up, no outreach, no continued conversation. And without that next step, the momentum dies. So the real question isn't just, did you attend? It's, what did you do after? Who did you follow up with? And what conversations did you continue? Like, what actions did you take? Because that's where the real value is built, not in the room, but after it. And I think that is one of the most honest parts of this whole conversation, because it would be very easy to leave an event feeling inspired and call that success. But inspiration is not the same thing as action. Motivation fades, calendars fill up, emails pile up, the day to day takes over, and suddenly the event that felt important gets pushed aside by everything that feels urgent. That is exactly how opportunity slips away. Not because the event did not matter, but because nothing happened after the event. And from an economic development perspective, this is something we think about constantly. How do we not only get businesses into the room, but help them stay engaged after they leave? Because that's where growth happens, when businesses step into new spaces, when they build new relationships, when they start exploring opportunities they hadn't considered before. And government contracting is one of those spaces. It's not out of reach and it's not reserved for a select few. It's not something you have to wait years to understand. It's something you can step into. And that's really the biggest takeaway I had walking out of that session. Not that it's easy, not that it's simple, but that it's accessible. And when accessibility changes everything. Because once something feels accessible, it becomes possible. And once it feels possible, people start taking action. So if you're listening to this and you've ever thought about government contracting, or maybe you've avoided it, or maybe you've told yourself that's not for me, I would challenge you to rethink that, because based on what I saw in that room, there is more opportunity there than most people realize. But it starts with a decision to show up, to engage, to start the conversation. And like you said, jump in. You'll figure it out along the way. And that right there is where the session moved from mindset into mechanics. Because after setting the tone and getting everyone comfortable, Mark shifted into what I would call the, okay, here's how this actually works part of the session. And this is where I think the biggest value was. Because he didn't stay high level, he didn't just say build relationships and move on. He started breaking it down into very real, very practical steps. And I'm going to walk through those the same way he did, because this is the part businesses actually need. The first thing he really emphasized was, you need to understand what you actually do. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's not, because a lot of businesses describe themselves in a very broad way. We do construction, we do consulting, we do marketing. That's not helpful in this space. Government agencies don't think like that. They think in very specific needs, very specific services, very specific scopes of work. So, what he was getting at is, you need to be able to clearly say, this is exactly what we do. This is exactly what we're good at. This is exactly how we solve a problem. And that sounds simple until you try to do it. Because most businesses know their work, but they do not always know how to describe their work in a way that lines up with how a buyer thinks. That is a different skill. A contractor may know exactly how to execute a project. A consultant may know exactly how to solve a problem. A service provider may know exactly how to deliver results. But if they cannot explain it clearly, quickly, and specifically, then the person on the other side may not know where to place them. And this is where vague language becomes expensive. If you say, we do construction, that could mean 100 different things. Do you build roads? Do you do interior renovation? Do you handle paving? Do you do site work? Do you provide emergency repairs? Do you do public infrastructure or private projects or both? That one broad sentence does not help the listener understand where you fit. And if they do not understand where you fit, they cannot match you to a need. The same thing goes for professional services. If someone says, we do marketing, that is too broad. Marketing for who? Marketing for what? Digital ads, branding, graphic design, community outreach, or recruitment campaigns, website development, public relations. The more specific you are, the more useful you become in the mind of the person listening. And I think this is where a lot of businesses accidentally make themselves harder to buy from. Not because they lack value, because they are describing themselves in a way that is too general to be memorable. So, before anything else, there is a real exercise here. Can you explain what your business does in one or two very clear sentences? Can you explain it without jargon? Can you explain it in a way that a buyer, procurement officer, or agency representative could immediately connect to a real world need? And if the answer is no, that is not a failure. It is just the first piece of work to do. Because clarity is not just branding. In this space, clarity is positioning. And that leads into something he talked about that I think a lot of people in the room hadn't heard before, your capability statement. Now, if you've never heard that term before, let me simplify it. A capability statement is basically a one-page document that says who you are, what you do, why you're qualified, and why someone should work with you. That's it. One page, not a brochure, not a website, not a long proposal. And he made it very clear. If you don't have this, you're already behind, because when you're in a room like that and you meet someone and they say, "Tell me about your business," you don't want to ramble. You don't want to be unclear. You don't want to say, "Well, we kind of do a little bit of everything." You want to be able to hand them something or send something that immediately answers that question. And he didn't just stop at the idea of it. He talked about how it should actually be used. This is not something that sits on your computer. This is something you use. You bring it with you. You send it after meetings. You attach it to emails. And I think this is one of those tools that sounds more complicated than it is. A lot of businesses hear capability statement and assume it is some formal government document that requires a consultant, a designer, and a 10-step approval process. It doesn't. At its core, it is a one-page business snapshot. It should make your business understandable at a glance. That is its job. Not to impress someone with how much text you can fit onto a page, not to tell your life story, not to list every project you have ever completed. Its job is to help someone quickly understand who you are, what you do, and why you are relevant. That means the layout matters. The wording matters, the order matters. If the most important information is buried, it is not working. If it is cluttered, it is not working. If someone has to study it to understand it, it is not working. And this matters because in a room like that, attention is limited. The person you are talking to may meet 20 businesses that day. So your materials need to help them remember you later. That is the standard, not perfection. Memorability